What you are about to absorb is the dissolution of ego meditative contemplation. This is a 5-step process in understanding what you truly are and who you truly are not. So sit back, relax, and let's dive deep into the infinite ocean of our true nature. Now in Zen they talk about, do you know your original face before you were born? Right? So this is the Atman in Vedanta, the undifferentiated consciousness. Before we become the ego, before we become Jason and everyone who is listening and watching. And so a lot of us don't know our original face. Now our original face, as we are born as a human being, we are still the original face, right? Before the socialization process begins. And that usually begins at a fairly young age because our subconscious is completely turned on from 1 to 5. But the innocence of a child is still there. The innocence of the original face is still there. This is why we hear a lot in the spiritual practices of the East that we need to return to our childlike nature. They're talking about going back to your original face. That innocence that we have as a child. Now you have that innocence because your mind is not polluted with the world and the conditioning that the world has, the socialization process that the world is. You're not conditioned with any of that yet. And so that's what the original face is. And so when we are in the bardo plane, so to speak, before we take on a rebirth, we are in our original face. And we are still the original face when we come into our form. One teacher explained it to me, when we see the joy in a child, that is because they have just come from the source. They still understand the nature of reality. And we were all once in that place. Before education came in, before our parents told us who to be, before society condemned us for who we aren't. And so our original face is who we truly are. The ego is who we truly are not. It's the accumulation of socialization, the accumulation of conditioning. Now, the original face is equanimous, naturally. Its nature is empty, spontaneous, and free. That's the nature of our mind, actually. And so the original face is basically the nature of our mind, which is empty, spontaneous, and free. In South Korea, Taoist teachers often say, wiping the Tao. Now, what they mean by this, the Taoist teachers in South Korea, when they say wiping the Tao, they're talking about cleaning the mind back to the original face, about getting rid of the conditioning, wiping the Tao. And unfortunately, a lot of people in South Korea who are laymen will make fun of the Taoist teachers in that sense, which is a whole other story. But the point is, we need to return to that original face. With Lao Tzu in Taoism, the original face is the uncarved block. Now you often hear Lao Tzu say that we need to return to the uncarved block. Now the uncarved block is the nature of wood before it comes into the hands of the craftsman, before it comes into the hands of the world, so to speak, of the human mind, to warp its nature, to shape it according to how the mind wants it to be, which is actually the opposite metaphor as we find in Confucianism, where Confucius has the carving and polishing metaphor, because he believes in the self-cultivation model. Now, a lot of people in spirituality often think in the sense of cultivation. Now, it is good to go through a cultivation process to disintegrate the ego, but the ultimate practice is to realize that you are fundamentally pure, empty, free, and spontaneous. You are liberated as you truly are, as the original face, as the uncarved block. But we invested into the cultivation method. We invested into self-cultivation. And Lao Tzu actually criticizes the cultivation method because he says all you need to do is return to the uncarved block. You are the uncarved block. Your nature is still wood, even though you've shaped it and contorted it. Your nature is still wood. This is Lao Tzu's point. And so before you get invested into a cultivation process, maybe you need to understand who you truly are as the uncarved block, as the original face. We need to contemplate who we were before we were born. We need to contemplate who we were before the socialization process. And who we were was the original face, the uncarved block. As the original face, you are not bothered by anything. You are completely equanimous. You are untouched by the wheel of samsara, by the wheel of birth, life, and death and rebirth. You are completely untouched by this cycle, by this process, because you are fundamentally the original face. And the original face cannot be moved by the winds of change. It is beyond change. It is the changeless. It is the ever-present. It is always now. It was never born. It can never die. It has no form. It is formless. But it animates the form. It is immanent within all things, and yet transcends all things. This is the original face. This was your true nature. And so your original face is unstained, pure. No emotion can stain it. No feeling can stain it. No external form of conditioning or agency can stain it. That is your original face. Untouched, completely pure. That's who we truly are. That's what we were before we were born, and that's what we were before the socialization process took place. Now my question to you is, do you identify as the original face, or do you identify with the socialization process of the ego that you've become? Now, what is the ego? A lot of people will ask the question, what is the ego? They think of ego just being egotistical, so being arrogant, being self-righteous and so forth and so on. But the ego actually is the identity, the persona system in Eastern spirituality. It is the sense of self, the sense of agency. It is all of this conditioning that we've accumulated through the socialization process. So the ego basically is the byproduct of the socialization process. So from a very young age, we start to endure this socialization process. We all do. We go through the socialization process from as young as 5, when we are fully conscious. But it also begins a bit before that, because our subconscious is completely turned on between 1 and 4, but we still have our childlike innocence. We're still connected more to the source at that young age. But then as we go through the years, especially through education, the ego is developing. We are accumulating the conditioning of our culture, of our religion, through our families, through what society says is acceptable. So we are accumulating all of this without even knowing anything about it. We're not taught this from a young age. And the great Eastern traditions, especially within Sanatana Dharma, Hinduism, they used to teach the children from a young age about the false ego and how to overcome it and return to the original face, to the Atman, if you will. And so the false ego is the accumulative set of knowledge that has become our identity. Now, not just psychologically, also physically. Our ego becomes the type of body we are, the type of race we are, the type of height we are, the type of weight we are, becomes our identity. And this is all illusory. That's the false ego. That's the identification with the body-mind matrix. And so the false ego is that which you truly aren't. It's just what you've become. It's the outer layer of your original face, the uncarved block, if you will, the Atman, if you will. It's become the outer layer. As they say in a lot of occult knowledge, they say you need to peel the layers of the onion away to realize your true self. And that's true. That metaphor is true. That's what we need to do through the spiritual process. And so the ego becomes an obstacle on the spiritual path for all of us, because it's so hard to overcome. And just when we think we've overcame our ego, it slips under the door. Maybe with an emotional response to somebody. Maybe with a certain piece of news that evokes a strong, intense anger. This is still the ego. Think about this. How many things trigger within you a sense of anger or hatred within the day? Or annoy you? This is the ego. Those acts of anger and hatred are built on separation, which is the essence of the ego. The ego is a byproduct of separation. It is the child of Maya. Maya here means the illusion of separation, the illusion of measurement. Ego measures reality according to this and that, based on the conditioning it has gone through, the socialization process that it has gone through. That is what the ego is. And so the ego is constantly dissecting between what is good or bad, what it likes or dislikes according to its conditioning. So it has a partial view. Its lens is partial. It superimposes its own view of reality onto the pure nature of reality. And that's not the way nature truly is. That's only the nature according to the ego. And all of our egos are different. All of our egos go through a certain socialization process and conditioning and culture and so forth and so on. And then we believe that's who we truly are. And it's not who we truly are. It's only what we've become according to a process. It's not our original face. It can never be our original face. It's a poor substitute. And so the ego's nature is inherently separate. It's inherently dual. As opposed to the original face, its nature is inherently non-dual. Its inherent nature is oneness, wholeness, because the ego is a limited structure. It's a fabrication. The identity is a fabrication. And when I say me, mine, I, this is an expression of limitation. You are dissecting the world according to the way you see the world. So the ego is fundamentally limited. And then everything from the false ego is then based on protection and security. So we create the tribes that we accumulate with. We create the in-groups and out-groups that we think are acceptable. And this is all violent and illusory. We believe that freedom is within security. Freedom is within protection, but it's not. Division is insecurity. As soon as you identify as a self as opposed to others, or as a group as opposed to other groups, then you are fundamentally operating from a place of insecurity. It's in division itself that creates insecurity, not security. We thought that security was within division, but it's not. That's what creates all the violence and insecurity in the world when we have division. It's ironic, isn't it? And it's all based on millions and billions of egos trying to control the reality according to the way they see it. This is where all violence and conflict and wars and discord come from. And so we need to realize our ego, and we need to understand that it is a virus within us that needs to be cleansed. Because the original face is always there. The ego, as I said, is a covering. It's like a pair of sunglasses that we're looking at reality through. We just need to take the glasses off. And so every action and reaction you have in the world is determined by the ego, because your actions and reactions are according to your conditioning. Does that mean you wouldn't react or act from the original face? No, that's not what I'm saying. Because from that place, from the original face, you will act with wu-wei, with a sense of effortless action, a sense of intelligent spontaneity, a sense of zen, being immediate and appropriate to each and every situation, because you don't have to think about the situation. Or there's a cup falling off the table, you go to grab the cup. You don't have to have an emotion about it, or you don't need to analyze about it. You just act immediately and appropriately to each and every situation from the original face. But from the ego, you act from emotions and feelings and identity and conditioning, which warps your ability to act and react in a pure way. So you act with hesitancy, not immediacy. You inhibit your action by hesitating. So you have a mind of deliberation, where in Zen we need to have the mind of no deliberation. And so the ego is going to always be a problem on the spiritual path. It's just a matter of how sincere you are on actually analyzing your ego, understanding it, and doing the spiritual work, not to eradicate the ego, but to come back and abide in your original face. This return is symbolized through Tai Chi in Taoism. Now in Tai Chi philosophy, Tai Chi is Tao in motion, and in this sense, Tai Chi means to return to the source. So the reversal of our awareness is being trained through the socialization process to be external. But once we understand that we are truly our original face, the uncarved block, then we need to reverse our awareness back into its heart, which from the Taoist context is Uchi. Uchi is Tao in stillness. So the nothingness of the Tao, the essence of the Tao. And so we're moving our awareness back in that process. So we are refraining from the gravitational pull of the external world and materialism. So we are disentangling our awareness, and to use yogic terminology, where we have prakriti, which is all of the energy of the physical and mental worlds, and we have purusha, which is the pure awareness, unstained, exactly the same as the original face and the uncarved block. And so what happens is the purusha gets entangled with prakriti because of the energy of prakriti always pulling the awareness into it. And so then we get entangled with the socialization process we've endured that becomes our identity, our ego. And then we see a world of separation. We see a world of illusion. But see, in yoga, they speak about you need to have this gap. So you need to have a gap between the prakriti and the purusha. And this is what the return is. You're pulling the awareness back and you're returning into the true stillness of nothingness, which is the qualityless Nirguna Brahman or Tao. Nirguna Brahman being here without qualities. Saguna Brahman is with qualities. Brahman with qualities. The ultimate reality with qualities. And so we are pulling that awareness back to within ourselves, back into our heart, so to speak, to our original nature, our original face, the uncarved block, the Atman, which is Brahman. And so this return we are all going through on the spiritual path. And so we have to realize how our awareness is entangled with the ego and the external world. See, your awareness, your original face has just become entangled with all of the mental and physical energy of the world. That's what prakriti is, right? Prakriti is the mental and physical energy, the soup of the world. And that is like a whirlpool, and our mind gets caught in this, and then we lose sense of the purusha. But the nature of prakriti is purusha, because purusha is the one who observes the prakriti. Prakriti would not exist without purusha. And so we have to pull our awareness out of this energy. We have to refrain from acting towards this dualistic energy. This is where discrimination, viveka, so discernment, so the ability to discern between what is real and what is not, and vairagya, which is non-reaction and renunciation of worldliness, where these two practices within spirituality come in. Because once you begin to discern between the real and the not real, then you begin to refrain from acting through the false ego, and you begin to abide as the self, as the Atman. And so then you don't react towards whatever the phenomenal world is trying to get you to act towards. You see it as a movie. Now, when you go to the cinema and you watch a movie, if you disagree with the actor playing a role, you don't start arguing with the screen, do you? Likewise, with vairagya, we see this screen of consciousness as a panorama of duality, the prakriti as a panorama of duality. It's not the Brahman alone. It's not the original face. And so why would you act towards it? Why would you get so invested and angry about it? This is a depth that we have to go to if we are serious about returning to the true self, the Atman, the original face. We can't continue to be vexed by certain worldly problems, by your own personal problems, your own personal anger, your own personal conditioning. You are purging that all out. As we start to disintegrate the identity, then you begin to disentangle the awareness from prakriti. And so then you begin to see reality as it truly is. You are essentially taking your steps home, the return to the source, the origin of all things. Instead of being caught out in this journey, in the material wilderness, lost, life after life after life, without any understanding of why you exist. This needs to be your last life. But you need to realize this through the process of returning to your true self. Once you return to your true self, this will truly be your last life. You don't have to worry about what your ego in this life is concerned about. Those concerns dissipate because there is no identity. There fundamentally is no identity. And those who continue to promote identity are just victims of individualism, which we see in the West. It's not a holistic perspective. But when we look at it from the Eastern perspective, Eastern philosophy is fundamentally holistic because the identity does not truly exist. It never did. This is not your life. This is Brahman's life. This is the Tao's life. This is the universe's life. It's not your life. You're experiencing it subjectively, but there is no subject. So the experience of subjectivity does not even exist. This is a localization of the one consciousness. But the problem is we identify with the equipment. We identify with this equipment, the localization of this equipment. I am this body, I am this mind, I am this name, I am this country, I am this sex, I am this race. That is my dog, so forth and so on. It's very nuanced, but we can overcome that if we start to disintegrate that identity through meditation, through sincere spiritual practice, as I said, with viveka and vairagya. Because it's imperative to disentangle your awareness from the external world. It is imperative on the spiritual path. What I do see in the modern days, I see, especially through New Age spirituality, where the proponents of New Age spirituality are trying to get you to be more of an identity and lean more into individualism, which can only cause more suffering because you are still separate from the world. You are not the world. You have isolated yourself from the world. But you need to realize that you are only a piece of life, a small piece of Brahman. And all there ever was Brahman and Tao. That's all there ever was, and all there ever can be. You were a temporary wave on the ocean of non-duality. But when you realize that you are fundamentally the self, the Atman, then your wave will begin to subside and the water of the ocean will become tranquil and reflective, like a pristine lake. Then and only then can you see into the nature of your mind, not when the waters are turbulent. And so to become who we truly are and who we truly were before the false ego came into play, we have to go through this process of return. And only those truly sincere will go through this process. We have to stop investing into the identity, stop investing into its beliefs and its conditioning through the practice of vairagya and viveka. And then the mind will begin to subside. The waves of the ego will begin to subside. And then you'll have pure equanimity within your mind. And you can see reality then as it truly is, in some sense, for the first time in this life. And so that is the process we all go through in dissolving the ego. There is this process of return that we all need to go through. It's very hard to be like someone like Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, who had a realization of the Atman of the self at 16. Those are very rare beings. And those rare beings just have an aptitude for that. It might be something related to past life karma, we don't know. But most of us aren't in that category. We have to go through this process of return, this process of thinning the ego out, chipping away little bit by little bit at our beliefs, at our conditioning, at our identity, and just continually chipping away until there's nothing left. I often hear the phrase when I'm in Tiruvannamalai in South India, the home of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, where a lot of people will say, I'm here just to be finished off. And that's what this process is. It's a finishing off process, finishing the ego off for good, where it doesn't come back, it doesn't slip back underneath the door. And so we have to truly finish the ego off through the process of return. And if we're sincere on the path of return, then it will thin out and it definitely will be finished. So that process all begins when you stop your awareness from being moved by the gravitational pull of the external world and abiding more in your true nature, which then reorients your awareness back on the journey within, returning to the source. But we can't have our awareness constantly eclipsed because of the process of socialization and worldliness. We have to overcome the socialization process and the byproduct of the ego and worldliness with all of the worldly affairs and concerns that the ego is consumed with. We have to refrain from that and turn away from samsara. We have to turn away from samsara and turn back onto the path, onto Brahman, Tao, Dharmakaya, if you will, Shunyata, but back to your true original nature and abide there as that, because that's who you truly are. It's who you were before you were born, and it's who you are always, but you've only forgot because of the false ego. And so once we abide there, then and only then can we see the world as it truly is and understand that this is not your life. The ego never existed. This life you are is not a name or a form, namarupa in Sanskrit. It's not an idea. It's not an identity. It's not a concept. It is fundamentally Brahman alone, the Tao alone. And you are that. You could say, I am Brahman, minus the I. And that's who we all truly are. But we only come to that realization when we are sincere on the return to the source, as opposed to being intoxicated by the ego. We need to refrain from that intoxication and purify our mind to see reality and the world not as dual, not as separate, but as fundamentally one. So we're going to speak about the element of restlessness. What is related to the vrittis? We often see the vrittis in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, but we see it all through the great traditions of the East. Vrittis in Sanskrit means this incessant mind activity or chatter we have in our mind, termed as kind of this whirlpool we have in our mind, which we get stuck in, and then we can't actually see into our true nature. They often use a lake as an analogy. So when there's a whirlpool or the water is disturbed with a lot of ripples, you cannot see into the bottom of the lake. But once the lake becomes tranquil, then you can see into the nature of the lake and you can see the bottom of the lake. And that's basically a representation for our mind. And so this is what is very important on the spiritual path, especially if we are talking about down-regulating the ego or essentially dissolving the ego. We need to look at this element of restlessness. Now, in the modern day, we are constantly agitating our mind, particularly due to digital technology, our phones and so forth and so on. And then you'll often see people tapping their foot on the ground unconsciously or tapping the table with their fingers and constantly moving. And this is a result of too much activity coming in through the senses, which agitates the system. And so this is where you need to develop a level of shamatha. Shamatha means in Sanskrit and samatha in Pali both mean calm or tranquility that we have within our mind. This is kind of the calmness of the lake that occurs after the vrittis subside. And so you need the spiritual practice to do that. You really need to be sincere about your spiritual practice to calm the mind and get rid of that restlessness. But as I said, we live in a society today that is constantly gearing us towards activity, making us do a lot of things, maybe to gain money or gain fame, or just even take care of your family. There's a lot of things that society is trying to push you to do. And unfortunately, as our society has evolved, it's become increasingly complex, and we are losing simplicity day by day. And that's why, as you get older, you remember how simple it was when you were a child, and that sort of phase of your life. And that's why we hear a lot of old people say, oh, it was better in the old days. What they're really talking about is a simplicity that is missing from the current complexity. And this continues generation to generation. So it is always simpler in the past as opposed to the present, especially due to technology and since the Industrial Revolution. So there are a lot of things that we actually don't think about, right? We don't think about that when we look at our current world. And so in our spiritual practice, we need to be focused on trying to get rid of that restlessness. We have to cultivate our life in a certain way that we're not going to agitate our mind with all of this incessant activity, because that is what keeps the ego alive, that incessant activity, because the ego then ruminates on this activity in your mind and believes this activity and begins to act from that activity. So you might be thinking about something that actually is not really any of your concern, but you think it's something of your concern, and you begin to act from that place, but it has nothing to do with you directly. You might have heard something on the news or so forth and so on, and then that affects the way that you experience your life. And we see this a lot, right? A lot of people do this, particularly with social media. People get so mad on social media because they might have read someone's post, who they don't know, mind you, and then that really triggers them, and then they begin to act from the vrittis. They have no level of shamatha. If you have a level of shamatha, you can just read over anything and then just move on. This is why when people see pictures of Ramana Maharshi and they say, well, Ramana read newspapers every now and again. He did, but he was reading them from the place of the self, of the Atman. And it was just like he could read it and not be attached or moved emotionally by what he was consuming. And we need to get to that place as well. So then we can then experience life without emotions and not be triggered by this and that, right? In the traditions, we are supposed to emulate the Tao, emulate Brahman. And so to emulate the ultimate reality, we cannot be overly emotional. And so to be less emotional, we have to work on this restlessness. We have to work on the vrittis. We have to calm the vrittis down, and we have to come back to shamatha. We have to calm those waters. And so that's where the spiritual work begins. So you have to notice within yourself if you are restless. Like, are you waking up in the morning and the first thing you do is check your email? Even though you know you should be practicing Tai Chi Chuan or you should be practicing Zazen. But you got to see that email. You are infected then by restlessness. You are infected by the vrittis. And we've all been there. We've all been there. Trust me. Even a master has been there. But it's an ongoing process to get rid of that restlessness. You can check that email, but you can check it in time, right? You don't need to get around to it immediately. It's like when someone says something to us and we think we need to react immediately to the situation, especially if it's a very sensitive topic. I always like George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's grandfather's advice. Gurdjieff's grandfather said to him, if someone says something to you that triggers you and you want to react immediately, pause and stop and come back in 24 hours and see if you even need to give any input. And if you need to give input, you've at least have had 24 hours to digest what has been said and to probably state your case in a more pure manner as opposed to reacting immediately. And so that kind of relates to, we spoke about before, Guyang and I, about the 2-minute rule, about, leaving that little gap. But Gurdjieff's grandfather takes it a step further and says 24 hours. But this has a big effect on restlessness because you'll notice in your body that your fingers might twitch. You might have a sensation in your brain to react immediately. But if you just pause and watch that for a second, you'll watch in an hour or two, it'll start to subside and those tranquil waters will begin to surface. And so that's what you really need to see. You really need to see that restlessness within you. And you can notice it because you can feel it within your psychosomatic organism. You can feel that restlessness. If you notice yourself tapping your foot or tapping your finger on the table, stop it and observe that. Observe that habit. Or if you're scratching or you feel like anxiety rising, observe the anxiety rising into your mind and just be a witness to that, because you need to start working on the restlessness aspect of the ego to get to any deeper levels, especially of the original face. And this is why it's very important for our spiritual practice. So remember, the vrittis constantly are turned on if we continue to feed them. So the less we feed them, the more we will have a state of shamatha. So if you're constantly looking at your news feed on your phone, or you're constantly watching TV, or people these days, they have a phrase, what do they say? They say Netflix and chill, when in actual fact, you're not really chilling because you're still feeding the mind full of, in most cases, garbage. So you want to refrain from that. You want to really refrain from that and start to observe yourself. Because if you're serious on the spiritual path, you need to turn that volume down on the vrittis, and you need to come back to that level of shamatha. And the way to do that is through sincere meditation and through observing yourself, observing the way you react to the world and you react to your own emotions. That's what's most important. See, as an ego, we constantly claim that this is our life. What about my life. Now, we can say that that is important for us on a subjective level. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't take care of your life. Obviously, you need to. You need to take care of your life, your own subjective experience, especially if you're considering about diving deeper into the spiritual traditions, because you need to tend to your life to a certain way and, in some sense, cultivate your life in a certain way that can facilitate deeper exploration. But one of the big problems and the obstacles to overcome on the spiritual path, especially when we go further into the spiritual path, is this sense of subjectivity that we have. It's something we need to overcome. We see a lot of the great masters talk about this, all the way from Buddha, Lao Tzu, all the way down to Ramana Maharshi. We see this sense of subjectivity getting in the way of actually experiencing the ultimate reality. And so what we do then is, as a subjective experience, is that we just constantly identify with this body and mind. And in doing so, we develop a sense of hypnosis, because then we live within this world and don't realize that consciousness is actually everywhere. It's not local within your psychosomatic organism. This is one of the big problems, because we constantly identify with the equipment of this localization of consciousness. We need to remember we are a localization of the one consciousness expressing itself. Everything is consciousness from the perspective of the Eastern traditions. And so we are just a localization of that one unified consciousness, but we begin to identify with the equipment, so the mind and body. And in this sense, the ego. We identify constantly with the ego. And the ego identity is built mainly on the identification with the body and mind, in the sense that we live within this border of our skin and everything else is separate to us. And this is an illusion, obviously, because we do belong to the world. And that's one thing that a lot of people forget. They think that they are isolated from the world because the skin is the border. And so they're at odds with everything else in the world. And then people start to then believe hypnotically that this is their life and not the universe's life. It's not your life. You are an aspect or a small piece of the universe. You're a small piece of life. And we forget that. We even forget that on the spiritual path. But most people in the average modern day forget that, obviously, that they are just a piece of life because they live within the borders of their skin. But when we look at it from a holistic, non-dual perspective, which is the nature of reality, then we understand that we are a part of life. We are a part of the process of life. We are still the Big Bang coming on. We are still Brahman and Tao, but we've identified with this complex ego identity that we've accumulated through the process of socialization. And this is where we need to reorient our focus back within ourselves and start to realize the origin of our existence. And this is what actually the great rishis did. When we talk about the great rishis of India, who was some of the first masters in the world who expounded this great knowledge for humanity to listen and learn from, they explored themselves to understand the nature of the cosmos. And they understood that their life is not their life. It's the universe's life. They're a piece of this life. They're a small piece of this life, but it's harmonious with everything else. We only become disharmonic when we identify within the border of our skin, within the border of our nations, and so forth and so on. When we have borders, then we begin to become disharmonic because we feel we don't belong and we are in a state of self-protection and security because we need to protect this mind-body complex. And there are reasons that you need to protect it at times, for sure. But in general, we don't need to live in protection mode. And we need to be expanding our consciousness to experience that ultimate state where we understand that it is the universe's life and not our life. We're just that small piece of life. In Shaivism, they speak about how the personal will is an illusion and actually gets in the way of accepting the universal will, so to speak. So don't think about will here in the sense of like God's will or this and that, but think of more in the sense of like the Tao emanating through all life is what we're kind of talking about in Shaivism, is that universal will or Shiva's will, so to speak, is that force that's animating our life, and we can align with that, but we need to down-regulate our sense of identity to come into alignment with it. This is what De is in Taoism. Virtue, meaning that if we use a river analogy in Taoism, if we're always holding on to the banks of the river, or we're fighting the current of the river, we're going to be in suffering because we're not letting go and allowing the river's power to become our power. This is what De is. This is what virtue. This is the virtue of the Tao, or the virtue of Brahman, so to speak. And so we need to let go of the banks of the river and stop fighting the current to allow the Tao's power to become our power. And that's what Shiva's will is. It's about letting go of yourself to allow it to move through you, because you are an aperture for the universe to express itself. But a blockage to that aperture is the identity, the ego. It blocks that. It's like a dam in the river. And so then the river can't sort of function in its proper way. Its power cannot be expressed in its proper way. That's where we begin to suffer. When we build the dam, when we fight the river, we're not allowing the universe's power to become our power. But if we downregulate our sense of self, our identity, and we understand that we are a piece of life, then the universe will make use of us in its own way and according to our own psychosomatic organism, or what we would call in Taoism as Li, organic pattern. So Li, organic pattern here means the psychological pattern that you have within your mind. So the aptitude you have for something in this life. We all have that. Yours may be music, mine may be writing, someone else may be gardening or cooking, so forth and so on. And so when we let go of that, then that's where we find our Li. That's where we find the universe's purpose within us, not our purpose, but the purpose of the universe. And that's difficult for us to understand because we constantly think of ourselves subjectively and don't identify with the whole. This is one of the core teachings of Jiddu Krishnamurti, because Jiddu always spoke about how part of the hypnosis is that fundamentally the individual is limited. But it's limited because we are constantly in this game of not identifying with the whole. Even though we all have the same emotions and fears and anxieties and love that every other human being has, but we're constantly trying to shun those and think that they're only isolated to us and no one else. And on top of that, we're not identifying with the whole as part of all of it. We're just identifying within this border. And within this border, we have these emotions, these feelings, this anger, and so forth and so on. And Jiddu's point is, the more you identify with the whole, the more those subside. That is what actually contributes to a greater evolution within the human species, is his perspective. Obviously, if more of us do that on a large scale, then we are going to be going in a positive direction collectively. But the point is, from Jiddu's perspective, and from what I'm speaking about today, is it's the totality's life. It's not your life. As an individual, as an ego, you are fundamentally limited because you've built all these barriers. You say, this is mine, I am like this, I am part of this country, I like this football team, and this is all a form of limitation because you think security is within division, but it's not. Insecurity is the essence of division. And that's where we get it wrong, right? Like we divide ourselves up into this group and that group, and I'm like this and so forth and so on. So we divide ourselves from the world, and that's what actually makes us, especially unconsciously, insecure and anxious and stressful, and we suffer as a result. But when we begin to open our consciousness and realize that we are part of everything, we actually are everything in some sense. We are the universe. It's not our life, remember? It's not our life. It's the universe's life. You just identify as this subjective experience, and you think that your subjective experience is the be-all and end-all. And it's not. There's been many other subjective experiences before this current time that you and I live in. And all of those people have died. They've all died. And hopefully some of them have realized what we're speaking about today. Because this is the great boon. This is the great liberation, and understanding that you're just a piece of this life. And so when you understand that, when you come into alignment with that, that's when we begin to be liberated and to be free and to be truly happy then. And then you can live your life in a free and happy manner without being boxed in by this identity that we've accumulated, this ego that we've accumulated. So that's fundamentally what we always got to remember. Remember, it is not our life, it is the universe's life. And all we need to do is start to peel the layers away of the ego. And as we continually peel those layers, then your consciousness starts to expand, because you begin to have an experience of the whole, as opposed to this little prison of our identity that we are trapped in. Shanti, shanti, shanti.